Before money became everything, life was measured differently, not by bank accounts, not by salaries, not by numbers on a screen, but by land, food, labor, trust, and survival. Long before modern economies shaped almost every part of human life, people still traded, borrowed, worked, and owed. But wealth did not always look like coins. Sometimes it was a field of grain, a healthy animal, a strong family, a useful skill, a promise kept by a neighbor. In small villages, ancient towns, and early kingdoms, people depended on one another in ways that are hard to imagine today. A baker needed grain, a farmer needed tools, a shepherd needed protection, a family needed warmth before winter arrived. And when there was no money in the way we understand it now, value came from what kept people alive. Food had value, water had value, shelter had value, time had value, trust had value. But slowly, the world began to change. Coins spread, markets grew, empires taxed, trade routes connected distant lands, and little by little, money became more than a tool. It became power. Tonight, we travel back into the forgotten world, before money ruled daily life, to understand how people lived, traded, survived, and measured worth before everything had a price. And if you enjoy calm stories that take you deep into the forgotten parts of history, subscribe to History Before Us, because every journey here is a step back into the world that came before us. And now, let us step into a time when wealth was not counted in numbers, but in survival. Before money became everything, life was not empty of value. People still needed things. They still wanted security. They still feared hunger, debt, cold, sickness, and uncertainty. But value did not always live in coins. It lived in the field behind the house, in the animals near the village, in the grain stored for winter, in the tools hanging on a wall, in the hands of a skilled worker, in the promise of a neighbor who would help when the harvest came. Long before the modern world turned nearly every hour into something that could be priced, people lived inside economies that were much closer to the body, closer to food, closer to land, closer to labor, closer to survival. A person's wealth was not only what they could count. A family with grain in storage had value. A household with strong animals had value. A person who knew how to repair a plough, bake bread, build a roof, make cloth, heal small wounds, or guide water into a field, had value, because in the old world, usefulness was a kind of wealth, and trust was often more important than silver. In a small village, people could not live as isolated individuals. Everyone depended on everyone else in ways that were direct and visible. The farmer needed the blacksmith needed food, the shepherd needed grazing land, the baker needed grain, the family needed firewood, the elderly needed younger hands, the children needed everyone. Nothing arrived from a distant factory, nothing appeared instantly after pressing a button. Everything had a source, and most people knew that source. They knew who grew the grain, who raised the sheep, who cut the wood, who repaired the tool, who owned the field, who had extra milk, who could be trusted, and who could not. That kind of world created a very different relationship with value. Today, money often hides the chain of labor behind everything we use. We buy bread, but rarely see the field. We wear clothes, but rarely know the hands that made the fabric. We use tools, but rarely know where the metal came from. In the past, those connections were harder to ignore. A loaf of bread carried the memory of soil, seed, rain, harvest, grinding, fire, and hands. A wool cloak carried the life of sheep, spinning, weaving, cutting, sewing and repair. A wooden bowl carried the forest, the axe, the craftsman and the time it took to shape it. Objects were not disposable in the way many things are today. They were kept, mended, passed down, used until they could no longer serve, because replacing something was not always easy, and because everything represented labor. This did not mean life was fair. It was not. The old world had inequality, debt, taxes, power, landlords, kings, temples, and obligations. Some people had abundance, while others lived close to hunger. Some controlled land, while others worked it. Some gave orders, while others carried the burden. But even inside that unequal world, money was not always the center of daily life in the way it is now. For many ordinary people, survival was organized around access to land, access to water, access to animals, access to tools, access to community, access to protection. A person could have few coins and still survive if they belonged to a functioning household, had rights to use land, could share labor with neighbors, and had food stored for difficult months. But a person with no land, no tools, no family, no trust, and no community could be in danger, even if coins existed somewhere nearby. Belonging was security. And that is something modern life can sometimes forget. In many ancient and medieval communities, trade did exist. People exchanged goods. Markets existed. Coins circulated in many places. Merchants traveled. Empires collected taxes. Cities depended on supply networks. But for the average person, daily life was not always ruled by buying and selling. It was ruled by producing, sharing, owing, helping, storing, repairing, and surviving. A neighbor might lend an animal for work. Another might help during harvest. A family might share food during a hard moment. A craftsman might be paid later, not immediately. A debt might be remembered by the whole community. A favor could become part of a long chain of obligation. This was not simple kindness. It was practical. If one family failed completely, the whole village could feel it. If fields were not harvested in time, food could be lost. If tools broke and no one repaired them, work slowed. If a roof collapsed before winter, people suffered. So cooperation was not just moral, it was necessary. And in that necessity, people built relationships that carried economic weight. Trust became a system. Memory became a record. Reputation became currency. If people believed you kept your word, you had value. If people believed you were lazy, dishonest, reckless, or impossible to depend on, life became harder. In a world without digital accounts and written contracts for every small exchange, the community itself remembered. Who helped last year? Who borrowed grain? Who returned the tool? Who shared during famine? Who cheated at market? Who disappeared when work became difficult? Everyone knew, and being known could protect you or follow you like a shadow. This is why the old world was both supportive and unforgiving. Community could save a person, but community could also judge them. There was less privacy, fewer secrets, less freedom to reinvent yourself. Your name mattered because your name was tied to your survival. Before money became everything, labor was also understood differently. Today, many people exchange time for wages. Work becomes hours. Hours become money. Money becomes rent, food, bills, comfort, and status. But in older worlds, much work was not separated from life in that way. Work was life. Cooking was work. Repairing was work. Carrying water was work. Watching animals was work. Cleaning grain was work. Making clothes was work. Raising children was work. Preparing for winter was work. Helping a neighbour was work. Walking to market was work. Praying, attending rituals, keeping customs, honouring obligations. Even these shaped the order of daily life. There was no sharp line between job and home for most people. The household was an economic unit. Everyone who could contribute usually did. Men, women, children, elders, each had roles depending on age, strength, skill, custom, and circumstance. Women's labour was especially central, even when history did not record it properly. The household often survived because women cooked, stored food, cared for children, managed small animals, spun thread, made or repaired clothing, carried water, prepared fires, helped in fields, and held together the invisible structure of daily life. This kind of work was rarely celebrated, but without it, society could not continue. Children learned early. They learned not through classrooms as we know them, but by watching, copying, carrying, trying, failing, and trying again. A child learned the value of things not because someone explained economics, but because life showed it every day. They saw how long it took to make bread, how hard it was to gather wood, how much effort went into feeding animals, how quickly food could disappear, how dangerous a bad harvest could be. They learned that waste was not harmless, that tools mattered, that weather mattered, that work delayed could become hunger later. The old world taught value through consequence. If you lost something important, you felt it. If you wasted food, someone noticed. If you failed to prepare, winter did not forgive you. And winter, more than almost anything, revealed what wealth truly meant. Coins could matter, yes, but coins could not warm you if there was no wood. They could not feed you if no one had grain to sell. They could not save animals if the fodder ran out. They could not repair a roof if no one knew how. Real wealth was preparation. A full storage space, dry firewood, healthy livestock, strong walls, good tools, reliable neighbours, knowledge of the land, and enough luck to make it through the season. Because luck was always part of life. A storm could destroy months of labour. A drought could weaken a region. A disease among animals could ruin a household. A ruler could demand more tax. A war could interrupt trade. A flood could change everything. People lived with risks that modern systems often protect us from. And because of that, they understood dependency very clearly. They depended on nature, on community, on custom, on memory, on faith, on power, and on the fragile balance between what they had and what they needed. In towns and cities, money played a stronger role. Markets were louder, busier, and more complex. Merchants bought and sold. Craftsmen charged for goods. Travellers brought items from other regions. Coins helped strangers exchange value without knowing each other deeply. This was one reason money became so powerful. It allowed trade beyond trust. In a village, you could rely on reputation. But in a market filled with strangers, money created a bridge. A person did not need to know your family. They did not need to remember your past. They only needed to accept the coin. That changed everything, because money made exchange faster. It made value portable. It allowed rulers to collect taxes more efficiently. It allowed soldiers to be paid. It allowed merchants to trade across distance. It allowed cities to grow. And slowly, as markets expanded, money began to move from being useful to being central. But before that shift became complete, many people still lived in worlds where value remained deeply personal. A person was not rich only because they had coins. They were rich if they had land that produced, animals that survived, children who could help, neighbours who trusted them, Tools that worked, a roof that held, food that lasted, and a place in the community that could not easily be taken away. This kind of wealth was slower, less shiny, less measurable, but to the people who lived by it, it was real, and maybe more real than anything written on paper. Because what matters most in a hard world is not always what can be counted. Sometimes it is what can carry you through the night. A warm fire, a stored sack of grain, a promise honoured, a door opened by someone who knows your name, a hand offered during harvest, a skill passed from parent to child, a path through the forest that your family has used for generations, a field that feeds you because your hands know how to work it. Before money became everything, life was not free from struggle. It was not pure, it was not fair, but it was connected. Value had a face, a place, a season, a memory. And as the world slowly changed, as coins spread, markets grew, cities expanded, and power became more tied to wealth, something ancient began to fade. Not disappear completely, but fade. The old understanding that survival was not only bought, it was grown, made, shared, protected, remembered, and trusted. That is where the story begins. Not with gold, not with banks, not with numbers, but with people standing close to the earth, trying to survive in a world where value was measured by what kept life moving. As communities grew larger, life became harder to organize through trust alone. In a small village, people knew each other. They knew who had grain, who owned animals, who could repair tools, who needed help, and who had already received help before. But once people began meeting strangers, everything changed. A farmer could trust the blacksmith in his village because they had known each other for years. Their families shared the same roads, the same church, the same seasons, and the same memories. But a stranger arriving from another town was different. Who was he? Where did he come from? Was his word reliable? Would he return if he promised payment later? Could he be trusted with goods, animals, or labor? This was one of the great problems of the old world. Trade became more useful, but also more difficult. A village could survive with local exchange for many things, but no community had everything. Some places had salt, others had iron, others had good timber. Others had wool, fish, wine, grain, clay, spices, or stone. So people needed to exchange beyond their own homes. And the farther trade moved, the more complicated value became. If one person brought wool and another brought grain, how much wool was worth how much grain? If a potter wanted meat, but the butcher needed shoes, not pottery, what happened then? If a merchant carried goods across dangerous roads, how should the risk be valued? If something was rare in one place but common in another, should it have the same worth everywhere? These questions slowly pushed human society towards systems that could make exchange easier. Before money ruled everything, barter existed. But barter was not always simple. The idea sounds easy. I give you something, you give me something. But real life was messier. People did not always want what the other person had. Goods could spoil. Animals could get sick. Grain could be heavy to carry. Tools could be hard to divide. A cow could not easily be split into small payments without destroying its value. So people needed objects that could stand between one thing and another. Something accepted by many people. Something easier to carry. Something that could represent value without being eaten, planted, or used immediately. In different places, different things served that role. Salt, grain, cattle, shells, cloth, beads, silver, gold. Each society found its own way. But the idea was always similar. People needed a bridge between need and exchange. a bridge between strangers, a bridge between today and tomorrow. This is why money did not appear only because people became greedy. It appeared because human life became more connected. As settlements grew into towns, and towns became cities, and cities joined trade routes, people needed a way to measure value across distance. Money helped make that possible. But before coins became common, value was still deeply tied to real things. Salt was valuable because people needed it. It preserved food. It added flavor. It could help communities survive beyond the harvest. In some regions, controlling salt meant controlling life itself. Cattle were valuable because they moved, reproduced, produced milk, pulled loads, provided meat, and represented wealth in a visible form. A person with animals had security that others could see. Grain was valuable because it fed people. A full storage house meant protection against hunger. A poor harvest could make grain more precious than metal. Metal was valuable because it lasted. It could become tools, weapons, ornaments, or stored wealth. Unlike food, it did not rot. Unlike animals, it did not need feeding. It could be melted, shaped, weighed, and carried. Slowly, metals became especially important, not everywhere at the same time, not in one simple moment, but across many ancient societies, metal offered something powerful. Durability, portability, divisibility, recognizable value. A piece of metal could travel farther than a sack of grain. It could sit in a chest for years. It could be weighed. It could be tested. And because it was useful and beautiful, people were willing to accept it. At first, exchange could happen through weighed metal. A certain weight of silver, a certain amount of copper, a piece of gold. But weighing metal every time was slow. It required trust in scales, purity, and honesty. So eventually, in some societies, rulers and cities began stamping metal into coins. A coin was not only metal. It was a promise, a mark of authority, a symbol saying, "This piece has recognized value." This changed trade in a quiet but powerful way. Coins allowed people to move value in their hands. A merchant could travel with wealth that was easier to carry. A worker could be paid in something accepted beyond one household. A ruler could collect taxes more efficiently. A soldier could receive payment. A market could compare prices. And slowly value became more abstract. A sack of grain was still grain. A sheep was still a sheep. But a coin could become many things: bread, clothes, labor, rent, tax, a tool, a journey, protection, a favor. A coin gave people choices, and that made it powerful. But it also changed the way people thought. When value becomes portable, people can store power in a small object. When value becomes measurable, people can compare everything more easily. When value becomes accepted by strangers, society can grow beyond personal trust. This was useful, but it also created new dangers, because once money entered deeper into daily life, those who controlled it gained new power. A landlord could demand payment. A ruler could demand taxes. A lender could charge interest. A merchant could accumulate wealth far beyond the goods he physically carried. A poor family could fall into debt. And debt, in the old world, could be terrifying. Debt was not only a number, it could mean losing land, losing animals, losing tools, losing freedom, losing your future harvest before it was even grown. A family might borrow grain during a hard season, promising to repay after harvest. If the harvest was good, they survived. If the harvest failed again, debt could deepen. This is how money could become both help and trap. It allowed people to survive a crisis. But it also gave others power over their tomorrow. Before modern banks, debt was often personal, local, and harsh. It could be tied to reputation, land, family, and social standing. A person who owed too much did not only face financial pressure, they faced shame, dependency, and sometimes loss of status. In this way, money began to change relationships. A neighborly favor was one thing. A debt, recorded and demanded, was another. The first created obligation through memory. The second created obligation through calculation. Both could be serious, but calculation had a colder feeling. It did not forget. It did not care if winter had been hard. It did not always care if children were hungry. It simply remained, waiting to be paid. This is one reason many ancient societies feared debt becoming too powerful. Some rulers occasionally cancelled debts or restored land to prevent society from breaking apart. They understood that if too many people lost everything, the whole system could become unstable. Because an economy is not only numbers, it is people. And when people are crushed too far, even the strongest system begins to crack. Markets also changed human behavior. A market was a place of possibility. It brought color, sound, movement, and surprise. People could see goods from nearby villages and distant lands. They could smell bread, smoke, leather, animals, herbs, fish, wine, and spices. They could hear bargaining, arguments, laughter, bells, and the voices of travelers. Markets made the world feel larger. A person who had never traveled far could still touch distant places through objects. A cloth dyed in another region, a metal tool shaped by another town, a spice that had passed through many hands, a story carried by a merchant who had seen roads beyond the horizon. Markets did not only exchange goods, they exchanged imagination. They allowed people to understand that their village was not the whole world, but markets also introduced comparison. Who had better goods? Who had more coins? Who could afford finer cloth? Who could buy instead of make? Who could pay immediately? Who had to beg for credit? The market made inequality visible in new ways. In a village, wealth might be seen in land, animals, harvest, and household strength. In a market, wealth could appear as choice, the ability to choose better fabric, better tools, more food, rare goods, or simply the ability to buy without fear. This slowly changed status. A person with money could move differently through society. They could hire labor, buy supplies, travel, invest, influence decisions. Money did not erase old hierarchies. Nobles still mattered. Land still mattered. Birth still mattered. Religion still mattered. But money began opening new paths. A merchant could become powerful without being born noble. A town could gain influence through trade. A craftsman with a valuable skill could improve his position. A lender could become feared by people above him. This was one of the quiet revolutions of history. Money allowed power to move, not completely, not fairly, but enough to disturb the old order. In towns, guilds began to shape economic life. A guild was not just a group of workers. It could control training, quality, prices, reputation, and access to a craft. Bakers, weavers, masons, metalworkers, merchants, and other professions formed systems to protect their work and their place in society. To enter a craft, a young person might become an apprentice. They would live under discipline, learn slowly, work for years, then, if skilled enough, become a journeyman, and perhaps, one day, a master. This path gave structure to work. It protected knowledge, it created standards, but it also controlled who could rise. Not everyone had access. Not everyone could afford training. Not everyone was accepted. So even when money created opportunity, society still guarded the gates. Still, towns grew. And with them, money became more common. Rent had to be paid. Goods had prices. Labor could be hired. Taxes could be counted. Records became important. Writing became more useful. The written word began following money wherever it went. Contracts, receipts, debts, accounts, lists, taxes, inventories. The world of memory did not disappear, but it was joined by the world of records. This was another major shift. In a village, people remembered. In a growing economy, people wrote things down. Writing made obligations travel beyond memory. It allowed rulers to know what was owed. It allowed merchants to track goods. It allowed lenders to prove debt. It allowed institutions to survive beyond one lifetime. A written record could outlive the person who made the promise. That made economic life more organized and more powerful, but also less forgiving. Because a person could argue with memory, it was harder to argue with a document held by someone powerful. As money spread, rulers saw its usefulness quickly. Taxes in goods were useful, but complicated. Grain had to be stored, animals had to be managed, labor had to be organized. But taxes in money allowed rulers to pay soldiers, build projects, support courts, and expand control. Money strengthened states. A king with coin could hire people beyond traditional loyalty. A ruler could fund armies. A city could build walls. An empire could collect wealth from distant provinces. This is where money began moving from daily exchange into political power. It did not simply help people buy things. It helped rulers command the world. And once power learned to use money, money became harder to escape. People who once lived mostly by land, custom, and local exchange found themselves pulled into wider systems. They might need coins to pay taxes. They might need markets to sell goods. They might need wages to survive in towns. They might need credit during hard seasons. Little by little, money entered places where trust, labor, and custom had once carried more weight. This did not happen evenly. Many communities continued old patterns for a long time. People still shared, borrowed, repaired, bartered, and helped. But the direction of history was changing. The world was becoming more connected, more measurable, more recorded, more dependent on exchange between strangers. And the more this happened, the more money became the language that different communities could understand. It was a simple language, not kind, not wise, not loyal, but simple. How much, how many, what price, what debt, what tax, what profit? These questions slowly moved closer to the center of life. And as they did, something human began to shift. Value started moving away from direct usefulness toward measurement. A field was not only land that fed people, it was property. A forest was not only wood, shelter, and mystery, it was resource. Labor was not only effort within a community, it was cost. Time was not only daylight and season, it was money. This transformation took centuries, but its early signs were already there wherever markets expanded and coins became necessary. Before money became everything, people lived in worlds where value had many forms. After money spread, those forms did not vanish, but they increasingly had to answer to price. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Because money solved real problems. It helped strangers trade. It helped cities grow. It helped crafts expand. It allowed goods to move farther. It gave people new opportunities, but it also created distance between maker and buyer, between land and owner, between debt and mercy, between labor and meaning, between survival and calculation. And once that distance opened, the world would never be the same. The old village economy had been limited, sometimes unfair, often hard, but deeply personal. The market economy was wider, more dynamic, more connected, but also colder, but also lose more. A stranger could help you by buying your goods, or ruin you by demanding payment. A coin could feed a family, or measure their debt, or reveal that you had nothing others wanted. This is the double nature of money. It is freedom and dependence, tool and power, promise and pressure. It connects people while also allowing them to treat each other as numbers. And as the old world moved slowly toward the modern one, this double nature became more important with every generation. For now, people still lived close to the land, still knew the weight of grain, still trusted neighbors, still repaired old tools, still feared winter, still measured wealth in animals, food, family, skill, and reputation. But beyond the village, in markets, ports, courts, workshops, and tax offices, a new force was growing, quietly, patiently, one coin at a time. As money spread through villages, towns, markets, and kingdoms, it began to do something deeper than help people exchange goods. It began to organize power. At first, a coin might have seemed like a simple object. Small, useful, easy to carry, a tool for trade. But once rulers understood what money could do, it became something far more powerful. It became a way to command labor, to feed armies, to build cities, to collect from people who lived far away, to turn the work of thousands into a system that could be counted. Before money became central, rulers still had power. They could demand crops, animals, labor, soldiers, loyalty, and tribute. A king could order people to build roads, dig canals, repair walls, or fight in war. But these systems were heavy. A ruler who collected grain needed storage. A ruler who demanded animals needed land and handlers. A ruler who required labor needed organization. Everything had to be moved, counted, guarded, and distributed. Money simplified that burden. Instead of collecting everything directly, rulers could demand payment. Taxes became easier to measure. Soldiers could be paid. Builders could be hired. Merchants could supply goods. And gradually, government itself became more dependent on money. This changed the relationship between ordinary people and power. In an older village economy, a person might owe work to a lord, grain to a landowner, or a share of harvest to a temple. These obligations were visible. People knew what was being taken because it came from their fields, their animals, or their hands. But when payment became money, the obligation changed shape. Now a family did not only need food, they needed coins. Even if they could grow grain, even if they could repair tools, even if they could survive through their own labor, they still might need money to satisfy the demands of someone above them. And that was dangerous, because if a farmer lived mostly from the land, but taxes had to be paid in coin, then the farmer had to enter the market. He had to sell something. Grain, wool, animals, labor, anything that could be converted into money. This pulled ordinary people into a wider economy whether they wanted it or not. The market was no longer optional. It became necessary. And once people needed money, those who controlled money gained influence over those who needed it. This is one of the quiet turning points in history. Money did not simply appear beside daily life. It reached into the field, into the household, into the workshop, into the tax office, into the army, into the temple, into the court, and, slowly, it became harder to live outside its reach. Temples and religious institutions also played a major role in this older world of value. Long before modern banks, temples could store wealth. They held grain, animals, land, precious metals, offerings, records. They organized labor, controlled resources, and sometimes acted as centers of redistribution. People gave to the gods. Rulers gave to the gods. Conquerors gave to the gods. And through these sacred institutions, wealth gained a spiritual meaning. This is important because in many ancient societies, economy and religion were not separate. A harvest was not only agricultural, it was divine blessing. A failed crop was not only bad weather, it could feel like a warning. A king's wealth was not only political, it could be presented as proof of favor from heaven. Temples collected, stored, and distributed resources in ways that shaped society. A person might work temple land, receive rations, bring offerings, owe service, or depend on religious charity during hardship. In this kind of world, value had layers. A silver object could be wealth, but it could also be sacred. A field could produce food, but it could also belong to a god. A payment could settle debt, but it could also fulfill duty. Money entered this sacred world carefully at first, but once it did, it gave institutions another way to measure obligation. What had once been given in crops, animals, or labor could now be valued, recorded, and compared. This made systems more efficient, but it also made them more abstract. A human life became easier to reduce into what it owed. A household became easier to measure by what it paid. A community became easier to control through records. And records, quietly, became one of the strongest companions of money. Where money went, writing often followed. Not poetry first, not stories, but accounts. Lists, ledgers, taxes, debts, inventories, names, amounts, dates. The written record gave memory a harder edge. A village elder might remember a promise with emotion, context, and mercy. A clay tablet, a parchment, or an official list remembered differently. It remembered the number. It remembered the obligation. It remembered what was due. This did not mean written records were bad. They helped societies function. They protected agreements. They allowed large systems to operate beyond the limits of memory. But they also made power more durable. A demand written down could travel. A tax recorded in one place could be enforced in another. A debt could survive beyond the conversation that created it. A person could be bound not only by community memory, but by official memory. And official memory was often controlled by those who already had power. As kingdoms expanded, money helped rulers see their people differently. Not only as subjects, but as sources of revenue. A farmer became someone who could be taxed. A merchant became someone whose goods could be taxed. A road became something that could charge passage. A bridge became something that could collect tolls. A port became a place where movement could be measured. The world became a network of payments. This changed the landscape itself. Roads were built not only for travel, but for control. Ports were guarded not only for safety, but for customs. Markets were regulated not only for fairness, but for revenue. Coins carried the face or symbol of authority, reminding people that even exchange existed under power. A coin could move from hand to hand, but it carried the image of the ruler. That image mattered. It told people who claimed the right to define value, who promised the coin was valid, who controlled the mint, who stood above the market. In that way, money became propaganda, a tiny message of authority passing through everyday life. A person buying bread might hold the ruler's symbol. A soldier receiving pay might hold it. A merchant crossing borders might carry it. A tax collector might demand it. The coin made the ruler present in places he could never physically stand. This was one of money's quiet powers. It extended authority through objects. But the rise of money did not affect everyone equally. For the wealthy, money created new ways to grow wealth. They could lend, invest, buy land, hire workers, store value, move resources, fund trade, support political ambition. For the poor, money often arrived as pressure, taxes, rent, debt, fees, prices, wages that were never enough. A bad season could push a family into borrowing. A sickness could force them to sell animals. A tax deadline could make them sell grain too early. A debt could make them lose the very tools they needed to recover. This created a painful cycle. The less a person had, the more expensive survival became. A wealthy person could wait for better prices. A poor person had to sell when hunger demanded it. A wealthy person could lend. A poor person had to borrow. A wealthy person could survive a failed harvest. A poor person might lose everything. Money did not invent inequality, but it gave inequality new forms. It made it more flexible, more transferable, more measurable, and sometimes more ruthless. Because hunger has a face, debt has a number, and numbers can feel colder than hunger itself. Still, people resisted a world ruled only by calculation. They held on to older values: hospitality, charity, kinship, religious duty, mutual aid, custom, honor. In many communities, a person was still expected to help relatives, support neighbors, give to the poor when possible, and act with some sense of moral responsibility. A person who had money but no generosity could be judged. A person who exploited others too openly could become hated. A lender could be feared but also condemned. A ruler who taxed too harshly could lose loyalty. So money grew inside a world that still argued with it. People needed it, used it, desired it, feared it, and criticized it. This tension is ancient. Money was useful, but morally dangerous. It could feed a family, but it could also corrupt a soul. It could connect strangers, but it could weaken community. It could reward skill, but it could also reward greed. It could help a city flourish, but it could also make everything feel for sale. Religious teachers, philosophers, and ordinary people all struggled with this problem in different ways. What should wealth mean? How much is enough? Is a rich person blessed or simply powerful? Is debt a fair agreement or a trap? Can money serve life without becoming the purpose of life? These questions are not modern. They are very old, because from the moment money began to reshape society, people sensed that something profound was happening. They understood that money was not only a tool in the hand, it could become a force in the mind. It changed what people noticed. It changed how they compared themselves. It changed how they imagined success. In a village before money dominated everything, status might come from land, family, skill, courage, age, wisdom, faith, or generosity. But as money spread, wealth became easier to display. Better clothes, better houses, imported goods, fine jewelry, more servants, more influence, more freedom from manual labor. The visible signs of wealth became stronger, and when wealth becomes visible, desire follows. People begin to compare, to want, to envy, to dream of rising, to fear falling. This did not happen all at once, but slowly, money gave ambition a new shape. For some, it opened doors. A talented merchant could rise. A skilled craftsman could build a reputation. A town could grow powerful through trade. A family could improve its future. Money could loosen old boundaries, but for others it created new chains. A wage labourer depended on payment. A debtor depended on mercy. A tenant depended on rent. A small seller depended on market prices. A poor family depended on forces far beyond their control. So the story is not simple. Money was not purely evil, and the world before money was not pure. The old world could be harsh, unequal, violent, and limiting. But as money became more central, it changed the meaning of dependence. Before, many people depended directly on land, kin, custom, and local authority. After, they increasingly depended on price, payment, debt, wages, and markets. One form of dependence did not fully replace the other. They blended. A person could owe labour to a lord, rent in coin, grain to a church, debt to a lender, and loyalty to a family, all at once. Life became layered. And the more layered it became, the more difficult survival could feel. Because now a bad harvest was not only hunger, it was missed payment, not only empty storage, but debt, not only suffering, but legal and social consequence. Money turned misfortune into obligation, and obligation could outlast the crisis that created it. This is why the spread of money changed time itself. In a world of food and seasons, value followed the rhythm of nature. Planting, growing, harvest, storage, winter. But debt created another kind of time, a deadline, a date, a future payment, an amount waiting ahead. Money pulled the future into the present. A person could be trapped today by what they owed tomorrow, and this made life feel different, more organized perhaps, but also more anxious. The future became countable. And what can be counted can be demanded. Yet, even in this changing world, older forms of value never disappeared completely. People still needed trust, still needed land, still needed food, still needed care, still needed hands to help when disaster came. A coin could buy bread, but it could not harvest a field by itself. A debt record could claim payment, but it could not comfort a sick child. A tax system could collect wealth, but it could not replace the human bonds that made life bearable. That is the hidden truth beneath this whole story. Money became powerful because it solved problems, but it never solved the deepest human needs. It could measure exchange, but not love, but not dignity. It could buy shelter, but not belonging. It could store value, but not meaning. And long before the modern world, people already sensed this. They lived through the moment when money was becoming more important, but the older world was still close enough to remember, a world where a person's worth was not only counted, it was known. Known by neighbours, by family, by skill, by generosity, by endurance, by the ability to help others survive. As coins moved through markets and taxes filled royal treasuries, that older sense of value did not vanish overnight. It remained in the background, in harvest fields, in shared meals, in repaired tools, in promises kept, in doors opened during hardship. But the balance was changing, and once money became tied to power, records, taxation, debt, and ambition, it began moving toward the center of history. Not loudly, not in a single revolution, but quietly, through every payment, every tax, every loan, every market stall, every coin passed from one hand to another. And with each exchange, the world moved one step closer to the age where almost everything would have a price. As money moved deeper into daily life, it began to change something very quiet. It changed the way people saw time. In older village life, time followed the land. There was a time to plant, a time to harvest, a time to gather wood, a time to rest when darkness arrived. But as markets grew, as towns became busier, as labor could be hired and paid, time slowly became something that could be measured in a different way, not only by seasons, but by work, by wages, by deadlines, by debts, by what a person could earn before the day ended. This was a major shift, because once time could be connected to money, every hour began to carry a price. A person working in a field for their household was producing survival, but a person working for wages in a town was selling part of their day, their strength, their skill, their attention, their body's energy. This did not happen all at once, and it did not happen everywhere in the same way. But slowly, across many societies, people began to live less by direct access to land and more by access to payment. A worker might no longer grow all the food they needed. They might earn coins, then use those coins to buy bread, rent a room, pay for fuel, or settle debts. This created a new kind of dependence. Before, a bad harvest was terrifying because it meant less food. Now, a lack of work could be just as terrifying because it meant no money to buy food. The danger changed form. Hunger remained, but the path to hunger became more complicated. In growing towns, the streets were filled with people whose survival depended on exchange. Bakers, brewers, porters, servants, builders, sailors, weavers, apprentices, sellers, carters, cleaners, guards, and labourers all lived inside a world where money moved constantly. Some people gained opportunity there. A skilled worker could build a reputation. A merchant could become wealthy. A craftsman could open a shop. A family could rise over generations. If work stopped, income stopped. If prices rose, hunger came closer. If rent was due, the roof above them was no longer secure. The old village had its own pressures, but town life brought new ones. It offered movement, but less certainty. It offered possibility, but also loneliness. In a village, everyone knew your name. That could be restrictive, but it could also mean protection. In a town, a person could become anonymous. They could arrive with hope and disappear without anyone remembering them clearly. Money made that possible too. It allowed people to move away from old ties, but it also allowed them to become detached from the relationships that once helped them survive. As trade expanded, merchants became some of the most important figures in this changing world. They understood distance. They understood risk. They knew where goods were cheap and where they could be sold for more. They watched roads, ports, rivers, seasons, politics, wars, storms, and taxes. They learned that value was not fixed. A thing could be ordinary in one place and precious in another. Cloth, salt, spices, metal, wine, grain, wool, timber, oil, glass, books, tools and luxury goods all moved through networks of exchange. Every journey added cost. Every danger added risk. Every border, toll and delay changed the final price. This made money more than a simple object. It became a way of reading the world. A merchant looked at a road and saw expense, looked at a storm and saw loss, looked at a city and saw demand, looked at peace and saw opportunity, looked at war and saw danger, but sometimes profit. More people began to understand life through calculation. How much did something cost? How much could it bring? How much time would it take? How much could be saved? How much could be owed? How much could be gained? Calculation itself became a form of power. Those who could count, record, compare, and predict had an advantage. This gave importance to writing, numbers, contracts, and accounts. A person who could keep records could manage business beyond memory. A merchant house could know what it owned in different places. A ruler could estimate taxes. A lender could track debt. A town could regulate payments. And as records became stronger, trust began to shift. Trust no longer lived only in a person's face, family, and reputation. It could live in paper, in seals, in signatures, in official marks, in written promises. This changed relationships again, a promise spoken before neighbors had emotional weight. But a written contract could travel farther. It could be shown to strangers. It could be enforced by courts. It could outlast the people who first made it. The world became more organized, but also more distant. People no longer needed to know each other deeply to exchange value. They needed systems. This was useful for trade, but it changed the feeling of life. The old economy was personal, even when unfair. The new economy could be impersonal, even when efficient. A person could owe money to someone they had never shared a meal with. They could work for someone who did not know their family. They could buy food from a chain of people they would never meet. They could be judged by a number written beside their name. This is where money began to feel larger than life. Not because it was stronger than hunger, shelter, or love, but because it became the gate through which those things were accessed. Food still mattered, warmth still mattered, home still mattered. But money increasingly stood between people and those needs. And when something stands between you and survival, it becomes powerful. In many places, land also began to change meaning. Land had always been valuable. It fed people. It gave status. It passed through families. It defined power. But as money became more central, land could be seen more clearly as an asset, something to rent, sell, tax, divide, use for profit. This could break older relationships between people and place. A family that had worked land for generations might find that legal ownership mattered more than memory. A field they understood with their hands could be taken, sold, enclosed, or rented under conditions they could not control. The land was still the same soil, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer only home, food, and ancestry. It was also property in a market. That transformation was one of the deepest in human history, because once land became increasingly tied to money, people who lost access to land often had no choice but to sell labor. They became more dependent on wages, and wage labor changed life in a quiet but profound way. When you work land your family depends on, the work is hard, but its purpose is direct. When you work for wages, you work, you are paid, then you buy what you need. This creates distance between effort and survival. A person may spend all day making something they will never use, carrying goods they will never own, building a house they will never live in, harvesting crops they cannot afford to eat. This does not mean wage work was always worse than older forms of labor. Older systems could be harsh, restrictive, and deeply unequal, but wage work created a new emotional reality. A person's survival depended on being needed by someone with money, and when they were no longer needed, they could be left with nothing. This made unemployment a new kind of fear, not simply the absence of work, but the absence of access. No wages meant no food, no rent, no fuel, no security. The person might still have strength, still have skill, still have willingness. But without someone willing to pay, those things could become invisible. This is one of the coldest changes money brought. It made human value easier to ignore unless it could be purchased. Still, people did not simply accept this new world silently. They carried older ideas with them. They still believed in fairness, in good measure, in honest trade, in the moral danger of greed, in charity for the poor, in duties between rich and poor, in the shame of cheating. Markets needed rules because people knew that exchange without trust could become abuse. Weights had to be checked, coins could be clipped or debased, prices could be manipulated, goods could be watered down, hidden, mixed, or falsely described. A dishonest seller could harm many people. A dishonest buyer could ruin a craftsman. So communities developed rules around trade, not always perfectly, not always fairly, but enough to show that people understood something important. Money needed morality around it. Without moral limits, it could damage the community that allowed it to function. This tension shaped towns, markets, and religious teaching for centuries. People wanted trade, but they feared greed. They needed lenders, but they admired wealth, but they suspected excess. They used money, but they worried about what it did to the soul. That worry was not imaginary. Because money created temptation in a concentrated form, it could be hidden, stored, moved, accumulated, used to influence others. Unlike grain, it did not rot quickly. Unlike cattle, it did not need care. Unlike tools, it did not have one obvious purpose. Money was possibility. And possibility can become desire. A person with enough money could imagine escape from ordinary limits. Better clothing, better food, better shelter, travel, influence, protection, status, freedom from certain kinds of labor. The dream of money became powerful because it promised control. Control over uncertainty. Control over hunger. Control over dependence. Control over how others saw you. But this promise was never equally available. For many people, money did not bring freedom. It brought pressure. A coin earned today was already owed tomorrow, to the landlord, to the tax collector, to the lender, to the market, to survival itself. This is how money could fill a life without enriching it. It could pass through a person's hands constantly and never stay. The poor touched money, but did not control it. They earned it only to release it again, and each release reminded them how little space they had between work and need. This created a different kind of poverty, not only lacking things, but always being behind, always owing, always calculating, always choosing what could wait, and what could not. Food or rent, fuel or debt, tool repair or clothing, medicine or tax. This kind of pressure is deeply human, and it has existed in many forms for a long time. The modern world did not invent it, it inherited it. As money became more central, cities became symbols of this new order. A city could be magnificent: walls, towers, markets, workshops, churches, warehouses, bridges, docks, and crowded streets. But beneath the energy, there was inequality everywhere. The rich lived with comfort and display. The poor lived with uncertainty and noise. Merchants negotiated large deals. Workers waited for daily labor. Officials collected fees. Servants moved through the houses of those above them. Begging appeared beside luxury. Abundance and hunger could exist on the same street. This contrast made the power of money visible. It showed that wealth could gather in one place while need gathered beside it. And yet, cities kept growing because they offered what villages could not always offer. Movement, a chance to change, a chance to learn a trade, a chance to meet strangers, a chance to sell goods, a chance to become someone else. Money helped create that possibility. It loosened some old bonds, even as it created new ones. This is why the story remains complicated. Money was not simply the enemy of human life. It also allowed people to move beyond the limits of birth, land, and local custom. It helped connect distant regions. It supported specialization. It allowed large projects. It made cities grow. It made trade faster. It allowed some people to rise who might otherwise have remained trapped. But every tool that creates freedom for some can create dependence for others. And money did exactly that. It widened the world while making people depend on systems they could not see. A villager could understand the field. A craftsman could understand the tool. A shepherd could understand the flock. But who could fully understand the price of grain in a distant market, the value of a coin changed by a ruler, the decision of a lender, the cost of war, the rise of taxes, the failure of trade routes? Money connected people to distant forces, and distant forces are difficult to resist. This was one of the great changes. People were no longer shaped only by local weather and local power. They were also shaped by markets beyond their sight. A harvest failure far away could raise prices nearby. A war in another region could disrupt goods. A ruler's need for money could increase taxes. A merchant's loss could affect workers who never travelled. The world became more connected, but also more vulnerable. Connection spread opportunity. It also spread crisis. And as these connections deepened, the old idea of value became harder to preserve. Once, value had been something you could touch. A field, a sheep, a loaf, a tool, a hand helping yours. Now value could be written, promised, transferred, borrowed, invested, lost, demanded. It could exist as a number before it existed as bread. And that abstraction changed the imagination. People began to live not only with what they had, but with what they expected. Future profit, future rent, future debt, future wages, future loss. The future became something counted before it arrived. This made society more dynamic, but it also made the mind less peaceful, because when the future is counted, it can be feared in advance. A person no longer worried only about tomorrow's weather. They worried about tomorrow's payment. The old anxieties remained, but new ones joined them. And slowly the world moved closer to a reality where money was not just part of life, but the language through which life was understood. Still, even in this changing world, something older remained beneath the surface. People still gathered around tables, still cared for children, still helped neighbors during disaster, still repaired what they could, still valued honesty, kindness, skill, courage, and memory, still knew that a person was more than what they owned. The old human truths did not disappear. They simply had to survive inside a world increasingly ruled by price. And that is where the sadness of this story begins to deepen, because money became powerful not by replacing life, but by standing in front of it, in front of food, in front of shelter, in front of land, in front of safety, in front of dignity. And once it stood there, people had to pass through it. Some passed easily, others struggled. And many spent their whole lives trying to reach the things that had once been closer to the earth, closer to the home, closer to the community. Before money became everything, value lived in many places. By this stage of history, those places still existed, but more and more they were being translated into price. And once the world learns to translate everything into price, it becomes very hard to remember what things meant before. There was a time when a person's life was not defined by what they could buy, but by what they could give, make, protect, and pass on. Before money became everything, value often moved through human relationships. A meal shared in a difficult season, a roof repaired before winter, a child taught a useful skill, a neighbor helped during harvest, a family remembered for keeping its promises. These things did not always appear in records. They were not written in accounts. They were not measured in silver. But they shaped survival. And in many old communities, this kind of value could be stronger than wealth itself. Because when life was hard, people needed more than coins. They needed people who would come when called. They needed someone to lend tools, someone to help carry wood, someone to watch children, someone to stand beside them during illness, hunger, or danger. The old world was not gentle. It could be cruel, unequal, and unforgiving. But it understood one truth very clearly. No one survived alone. In that world, giving was not always charity in the modern sense. Sometimes it was duty. Sometimes it was honor. Sometimes it was fear of being judged. Sometimes it was faith. And sometimes it was simply memory. A person helped because one day they might need help too. A household shared because next winter they might be the ones with empty storage. A family gave because everyone knew that fortune could change quickly. Today, money can make survival feel individual. If you have enough, you can buy what you need. But before money ruled every part of life, survival was often collective. Your safety depended on your place inside a web of relationships. And that web had to be maintained. Through work, through generosity, through respect, through reputation, through showing up when others needed you. This is why hospitality mattered so much in many ancient and medieval societies. To welcome a traveller, feed a guest, or offer shelter was not only kindness, it was part of a moral world. A stranger on the road was vulnerable. A traveller far from home depended on the mercy of others. And in return, that traveller carried stories, news, blessings, trade, warnings, or connections. Hospitality created bridges where money could not always reach. It reminded people that a human being had value before any payment was made. But as money became more central, hospitality also began to change. A guest could become a customer, a meal could become a service, a bed could become a toll, a favour could become a toll. This did not happen everywhere at once. And it did not destroy generosity completely, but it slowly changed the emotional meaning of exchange. When payment enters a relationship, the relationship becomes clearer in one way and colder in another. No one has to remember a favour. No one has to feel deeply obligated. The coin settles the matter. The transaction ends, and that can feel clean, efficient, simple, but it can also remove something older. The long memory between people, the sense that lives are tied together beyond one moment of exchange. A paid service may solve a problem, but it does not always create belonging. This is one of the quiet losses in the long history of money. Not that people stopped caring, but that more and more parts of life could be separated from care. A person could pay for help without being known. A person could receive service without being connected. A person could live surrounded by transactions and still feel alone. In older communities, loneliness existed too, but it had a different shape. People might suffer under judgment, control, gossip, or lack of freedom. Yet they were often visible to others. Their absence was noticed. Their struggles were known. Their name carried history. As money grew stronger, people could move more easily, but they could also disappear more easily. Cities especially made this possible. In a city, a person could become anonymous. They could arrive from another village, another region, another life. They could work for wages, rent a room, buy food from strangers, and pass through crowds where no one knew their parents, their childhood, their promises, or their shame. This anonymity could be liberating. For someone trapped by village expectations, the city could offer a second beginning, but it could also be frightening. Because when no one knows you, no one remembers what you once gave. No one knows whether you are honest. No one knows whether you are hungry. No one knows what you lost. Money helped people live among strangers, but it also made stranger life normal. And with that came a new kind of human distance. In the old world, status was often tied to visible roles: the farmer, the priest, the lord, the craftsman, the widow, the healer, the elder, the apprentice. Everyone occupied a place that others understood. Money did not erase these roles, but it created another question above them all. How much do they have? This question became more powerful over time. A person's clothing, house, tools, animals, servants, land, and eventually coins could signal their place in society. Wealth became a language, and people learned to read it. Fine fabric spoke, jewelry spoke, a horse spoke, imported goods spoke, a larger house spoke. Even the ability to avoid manual labor spoke. Money gave status a new brightness. It allowed people to display success in ways others could immediately see. But it also created comparison, and comparison can change the soul of a community. When people compare constantly, contentment becomes harder. A person who once felt secure because they had enough grain for winter might begin to feel poor beside someone with finer clothes. A craftsman who once took pride in skill might feel small beside a merchant with more silver. A family that once valued reputation might begin to fear looking unsuccessful. Money did not invent envy, but it gave envy more objects to hold. It gave people more visible signs of difference. And, slowly, being respected could become tied less to what someone contributed and more to what they possessed. This shift did not happen without resistance. Many cultures warned against greed. Religious teachers spoke of generosity, humility, and the danger of loving wealth too much. Stories praised the simple, the honest, the faithful, the poor who remained good, the rich who gave freely. Communities admired generosity because they understood that wealth without duty could damage everyone. A rich person who never helped others was not always admired. They might be feared, resented, condemned, because in a world still close to hunger, hoarding felt dangerous. If one household had too much and another had nothing, the moral balance of the community was disturbed. This is why feasts, gifts, donations, and public generosity mattered. Powerful people often gave publicly. They sponsored religious buildings, fed the poor on special days, paid for festivals, supported churches, temples, shrines, or community projects. Some did it from faith, some from pride, some from pressure, some because generosity was part of ruling. To hold wealth was to carry expectation, at least in theory. But as money became more abstract, wealth could become easier to hide. A field is visible. A herd is visible. A full barn can be known. But money can disappear into chests, accounts, loans, trade networks, and promises. Hidden wealth changed trust. People might suspect others of having more than they showed. Rulers might suspect subjects of hiding taxable value. Neighbours might suspect merchants of unfair profit. The invisible nature of money created suspicion, and suspicion created new systems of control. More records, more inspections, more laws, more officials. A society built on money needs ways to verify what cannot be seen. This made the world more administrative. Not necessarily more just, but more counted. Names were written, goods were listed, payments were tracked, fines were recorded, debts were preserved. The human world became increasingly surrounded by documents. And once that happened, memory began to lose some of its old authority. A grandmother's memory, a neighbour's witness, These still mattered, but written records began to stand above them. A person could say, "I remember." The official could answer, "But the record says otherwise." That was a new kind of power. Quiet, cold, difficult to resist. Money and writing together created systems that could outlive individual lives. A debt could survive the debtor. A property claim could survive the owner. A tax obligation could pass through generations. A contract could bind people who had never met. This allowed societies to become larger and more complex, but it also meant that human life could be trapped inside rules made far away. Rules without a face. Rules without memory. Rules without mercy. In the old world, hardship was often immediate. A storm, a failed harvest, a sick animal, a broken tool, a burned roof. But in the money world, hardship could also be invisible at first. A line in an account, a rising price, a tax increase, a loan coming due, a currency losing value, a market shifting somewhere far away. A person might wake up and find that nothing physical had changed around them, and yet their life had become harder. The same house, the same field, the same hands, the same hunger. But now the numbers had changed. And when numbers change, people suffer in ways that are difficult to explain to the earth, the animals, or the sky. This was one of the strangest transformations in human life. People became vulnerable not only to nature, but to systems. Not only to drought, but to debt. Not only to winter, but to price. Not only to hunger, but to the market. The danger had moved from the visible world into the invisible one. And invisible dangers are harder to fight. You can see a storm approaching. You can see a field failing. You can see a roof breaking. But you cannot always see why prices rise, why work disappears, why taxes increase, why coins lose value, why someone far away makes a decision that changes your life. Money connected the world. But connection also meant exposure. The more people depended on exchange, the more they depended on forces beyond their understanding. Still, even as money expanded, people continued to create meaning outside of it. They sang, they married, they buried their dead, they blessed homes, they celebrated harvests, they told stories, they taught children, they repaired old things, they gave gifts, they remembered kindness, they judged greed, they honored those who helped when payment was not possible. Because no matter how strong money became, it could never fully replace human meaning. A coin could pay for bread, but it could not give thanks for the hands that baked it. A coin could rent a room, but it could not make it feel like home. A coin could hire labor, but it could not create loyalty by itself. A coin could buy medicine, but not the comfort of someone sitting beside you through the night. A coin could purchase a burial, but not grief. This is why the story of money is not only an economic story, it is emotional, spiritual, social. It is about what happens when one form of value becomes so powerful that it begins to overshadow the others. Before money became everything, value was scattered across life, in land, in tools, in memory, in faith, in family, in skill, in courage, in patience, in the ability to endure. Money gathered many of these values into one form. That made life easier in some ways, but it also made life narrower, because when one measure becomes dominant, people begin to forget the things it cannot measure. A person's kindness has no clear price. A quiet sacrifice has no market value. A peaceful evening cannot be stored in a treasury. A trusted friendship cannot be minted. A life well lived cannot be weighed like silver, and yet these things are often what people remember most, not the exact amount someone owned, but how they treated others, how they carried hardship, how they gave when giving was difficult, how they remained human when life became hard. This older understanding never fully disappeared. It survived in families, in villages, in religious teachings, in stories, in customs of sharing, in the shame attached to greed, in the respect given to fairness, in the deep human feeling that some things should not be for sale. But as the world moved forward, that feeling had to fight harder, because the market kept expanding, and money kept finding new places to enter. Work, land, time, food, shelter, travel, justice, education, care, even dreams. The more money entered, the more people needed it, and the more people needed it, the more powerful it became. This is how money moves from tool to master, not in one dramatic moment, but quietly, by becoming necessary, by standing at the door of every need, by making people ask before almost anything else, "Can I afford it?" That question would have sounded strange in older worlds, where the first question might have been different. Do we have enough grain? Who can help? What does custom allow? What does the land provide? What do we owe? What will the community remember? But slowly many questions became one question. How much? And once how much becomes the first question, the world has changed. Not completely, but deeply, because then value is no longer discovered through relationship first. It is discovered through price. And price is powerful because it is clear. Life is layered. A thing can be cheap and precious, expensive and meaningless, free and irreplaceable. A shared meal can matter more than a purchased feast. A handmade object can carry more memory than something richer. A small act of help can change a life more than a bag of coins. The old world understood this because it had to. People saw value in what sustained life directly. The modernizing world began to see value in what could be exchanged. And between those two ways of seeing, human history quietly shifted. So when we imagine people before money became everything, we should not imagine a perfect world. It was not perfect. It had hunger, hierarchy, violence, disease, exploitation, and fear. But it also had a closeness between value and life that is easy to lose. People knew that grain mattered because hunger was near. They knew tools mattered because labor depended on them. They knew neighbors mattered because isolation was dangerous. They knew reputation mattered because trust could open doors. They knew generosity mattered because fortune changed. They knew land mattered because life came from it. Money did not erase these truths, but it covered them, layer by layer, until many people began to see the symbol before the thing itself, the price before the need, the profit before the person, the number before the life. And that is where the old world begins to feel distant from us. Not because they had no money. Many did. Not because they had no trade. They traded. Not because they did not understand wealth. They understood it well. But because they still lived close enough to survival to know that money was never the source of life, it was only a tool moving through it. Life came from the field, from the hand, from the water, from the animal, from the family, from the community, from the fragile promise that people would not abandon each other completely. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden in this forgotten world. Before money became everything, people still struggled. They still owed. They still feared poverty. But they also knew that the deepest forms of value could not always be counted. They had to be lived. They had to be remembered. And they had to be protected before the world forgot what they were. There came a point in history when money stopped being something people used only when they needed it. It became something people had to chase. That was the real turning point, not the first coin, Not the first market, not the first tax, but the slow moment when ordinary life began to depend on constant payment. For much of the older world, a person could still live partly outside money. They might grow food, keep animals, repair tools, share labour, gather wood, and rely on family or community. Coins mattered, but they did not always stand at the centre of every day. But as societies changed, that old space became smaller. More land became controlled, more labour became paid, more goods moved through markets, more people left villages for towns, more rulers demanded money instead of service or crops. And little by little, survival moved away from direct access to life's necessities. It moved toward access to income. That is when money became truly powerful. Because when you need money to reach food, shelter, warmth, safety, medicine, transport, and dignity, money is no longer just a tool. It becomes the doorway, and the person without it stands outside. This did not happen in one place or one year. It happened slowly, across centuries, in different ways across the world. But the direction was clear. People who once lived close to land were pushed into economies where they had to sell something to survive. Sometimes they sold crops, sometimes they sold animals, and sometimes they sold the only thing left, their labour. This changed the meaning of the human body. A worker's strength became measurable. A day became measurable. An hour became measurable. A task became measurable. The body, once part of a household and community rhythm, became part of a market rhythm. Someone could ask, how much is this work worth? How long will it take? How little can I pay? How much can I gain? And once those questions became normal, life changed. In the older world, work had been difficult, often exhausting, and sometimes unfair, but it was usually tied directly to visible survival. You worked the field because the field fed you. You repaired the roof because winter was coming. You helped with harvest because the whole village needed food. Now, more and more people worked for someone else's profit. They made things they might never own. They built wealth they might never touch. They gave their bodies to labour and received coins that vanished almost as soon as they arrived. Rent, food, debt, fuel, clothing, taxes. The money passed through their hands like water, and still they had to return the next day. This is one of the quiet tragedies of the money world. A person can work constantly and still remain poor, not because they are lazy, not because they do not contribute, but because the system around them decides how much their contribution is worth. And often, it decides that survival should cost almost everything they earn. At the same time, the meaning of wealth became more distant. In a village, wealth could be seen in full barns, healthy animals, good tools, strong family ties, and respected skill. But in a larger money economy, wealth could become invisible, stored in accounts, written in contracts, spread across trade. Hidden in ownership, protected by law, a wealthy person no longer needed to stand beside the field, the workshop, or the ship that produced their income. They could own from a distance. Profit could arrive without presence. That was a new kind of power. Older power had often been visible. The lord lived near the land. The temple stood in the city. The ruler's soldiers could be seen. The tax collector arrived in person. But money allowed power to become quieter. A person far away could control land they never touched. A lender could shape the life of a farmer they never met. A merchant could profit from labour in places they would never visit. A ruler could fund war through taxes collected from people who had no voice in the decision. Money made distance profitable, and distance made responsibility easier to ignore. When you know the person who grows your food, it is harder to forget their humanity. When you never see them, they become part of a price. When you know the person who repairs your shoes, their labor has a face. When the work happens far away, it becomes just another cost. This distance grew as trade expanded. Ships crossed seas, caravans crossed deserts. Goods moved through ports, warehouses, markets, and cities. People began to consume things produced far from their own communities: spices, cloth, metals, sugar, tea, coffee, dyes, silk, and countless other goods changed daily life for those who could afford them. The world became richer in objects, but not always richer in justice, because behind many beautiful goods were hard systems. Labor, extraction, control, debt, empire. Conquest, some people gained comfort from the widening economy. Others paid for that comfort with their land, freedom, or bodies. This is another truth about money becoming everything. It can make suffering easier to hide. A finished product looks clean. A coin looks simple. A price looks neutral. But behind them may be long chains of labor, danger, and inequality. The buyer sees the object. The seller sees the price. But the human cost often disappears somewhere in between. And when the human cost disappears, people begin to believe that the market is natural, as if prices simply exist, as if poverty simply happens, as if wealth simply belongs to those who have it. But history shows that money systems are built by laws, by rulers, by wars, by land ownership, by taxation, by trade rules, by debt, by force, by habit, by belief. Money becomes everything only when society agrees or is forced to place it at the center. And once it is there, it begins to shape even the imagination. People start dreaming in money. A better life means more income. Security means savings. Success means ownership. Freedom means buying power. Time becomes something to spend. Life becomes something to afford. Even happiness begins to sound expensive. A better home, better clothes, better status, better escape, better everything. And slowly, the old forms of value become quieter. Not gone, but quieter. A good neighbour matters, but cannot pay rent. A peaceful evening matters, but cannot settle debt. A skill matters, but only if someone pays for it. A generous heart matters, but may not protect you from hunger. A person may be kind, wise, loyal, and useful, but if they have no money, the modern world can treat them as if they have failed. That is a cruel change, because before money became everything, value was more scattered. A person could be poor in coins but rich in belonging, poor in possessions but rich in knowledge, poor in luxury but rich in trust, poor in status but necessary to the community. But when money becomes the main measure, all these other values are pushed into the background. They still exist, but they become harder to defend. This is why people began to fear poverty differently. In older communities, poverty was still painful. It could mean hunger, dependence, shame, and danger. But the poor person might still be known. They might still have a place, however difficult. They might still be part of a network of obligation. In a money-centered world, poverty could become isolation. No money meant no access. No access meant exclusion. From homes, from food, from medicine, from education, from respect, from choices, and sometimes from being seen as fully human. This is the deepest wound money can create. Not hunger alone, but the feeling that a person's worth has been reduced to what they can pay. As cities expanded, this wound became more visible. Crowded streets held every level of life. The wealthy passed through with fine clothing, servants, carriages, goods, and confidence. The poor moved through the same streets carrying burdens, looking for work, waiting for wages, selling small items, or asking for help. The distance between lives could be only a few steps, a bright window, a dark alley, a full table, an empty stomach, a locked door, a person outside. Money made these divisions visible every day, but it also made them seem normal. That may be the most powerful thing money ever did. It taught people to accept separation. Those who can pay go in, those who cannot stay out. Those who own command, those who need obey, those who lend wait, those who borrow worry, those who profit rise, those who labour continue. And because all of it passes through numbers, it can look orderly, even when it is painful. Still, human beings never fully surrendered to this logic. Even in the most money-driven societies, people continued to create spaces where value meant something else. Families cared for one another without invoices. Friends gave time without accounting. Communities shared food during crisis. Neighbors helped after fires, floods, illness, and loss. People gave gifts. People volunteered. People sang, prayed, repaired, listened, comforted, and remembered. All of this survived because money cannot complete human life. It can organize exchange, but it cannot replace love. It can buy service, but not devotion, but not create home. It can purchase medicine, but not remove fear. It can buy entertainment, but not meaning. It can build a monument. And deep down, people know this. That is why even in a world ruled by money, the most precious moments often remain outside price, a hand held during grief, a meal shared without expectation, the story told by an elder, a child sleeping safely, a promise kept when no one was watching, a person returning when they could have walked away. These things belong to an older economy, an economy of care, an economy of trust, an economy of memory. It never fully disappeared. It simply became harder to hear beneath the noise of price. And perhaps that is what this story is really about. Not a world with money against a world without money, but a struggle between two ways of seeing life. One says value is what can be counted. The other says value is what keeps us human. One says everything has a price. The other says some things must never be sold. One says time is money. The other says time is life. And for centuries, these two visions have lived beside each other, inside markets, inside homes, inside cities, inside people. Because even the person chasing money often knows they are chasing safety, not numbers, safety, food, shelter, rest, respect, a future for their children, a place where they can stop being afraid. Money becomes powerful because it attaches itself to real human needs. That is why it is so difficult to resist. People do not chase money because metal or paper is sacred. They chase it because the world has placed food, shelter, care, and freedom behind it. And so the question is not simply why people became obsessed with money. The question is why survival became so dependent on it. That is the historical shift. Once survival passes through money, money becomes unavoidable. Once dignity passes through money, money becomes emotional. Once freedom passes through money, money becomes a dream. And once dreams pass through money, it becomes everything. But the older world still whispers beneath the surface. It reminds us that value began somewhere else, in the field, in the home, in the shared fire, in the skilled hand, in the trusted neighbor, in the stored grain, in the song, in the ritual, in the gift, in the promise, in the simple fact that people needed one another before they needed coins. And maybe that memory matters. Because a society that forgets every value except money becomes fragile. It may become rich in objects, but poor in meaning, fast in exchange, but slow in compassion, efficient in markets, but lonely in daily life, powerful in numbers, but uncertain in spirit. Before money became everything, life was harder in many ways. But it was also closer to the sources of value. People knew that bread came from labour and land, that warmth came from wood and fire, that safety came from others, that trust had to be earned. The modern world has not fully lost these truths, but it often hides them behind prices, behind accounts, behind distance, behind the illusion that everything can be bought by someone somewhere somehow. Yet when crisis comes, the old truths return. When storms arrive, people need neighbours. When illness comes, people need care. When loneliness grows, people need presence. When fear rises, people need trust. When systems fail, people remember community. And in those moments, money is still useful, but not enough. It was never enough. That is what people before us understood more clearly than we do. They lived closer to danger, so they lived closer to dependence. They knew that life could not be carried by coins alone. It had to be carried by hands, by memory, by obligation, by mercy, by the willingness of one person to help another continue. And as the world moved closer to the age of money, that older truth did not die. It waited, quietly, underneath everything. As the centuries passed, money became lighter. At first, value had weight. Grain was heavy. Animals needed care. Metal had to be mined, melted, shaped, carried, guarded. A coin could be held in the hand. It had a sound when it struck a table. It had a face, a mark, a shape, a coldness against the skin. But slowly, value began to leave the hand. It moved into paper, into signatures, into promises, into numbers, into systems people could not see. This was another great transformation, because when value becomes invisible, it becomes easier to multiply and easier to misunderstand. Paper money did not feel like grain. It did not smell like wool. It did not shine like gold. It was fragile, thin, almost ordinary. And yet, people accepted it because something behind it said it mattered. A ruler, a bank, a government, a network of trust larger than any village had ever known. This was strange if you think about it quietly. A piece of paper could feed a family, pay a worker, settle a debt, open a door, buy land, fund a journey, change a life. Not because the paper itself could do anything, but because society agreed to believe in it. Money had always required belief. Even coins required belief. But paper made that belief more obvious. It showed that wealth was no longer only a material thing. It was confidence. It was authority. It was trust placed into symbols. And once people accepted that, the world of money expanded faster than ever before. Banks grew more powerful. Credit became more important. Loans shaped businesses, farms, houses, cities, and governments. A person no longer needed to hold all the wealth in front of them. They could borrow from the future. They could promise payment later. They could build now and owe tomorrow. This made growth faster, but it also made anxiety deeper, because debt is a shadow that walks ahead of you. It belongs to the future, but it follows you in the present. A person could live in a house not fully owned, work with tools not fully paid for, run a shop built on borrowed money, sleep beneath a roof that depended on next month's payment. The modern money world did not only change what people had, it changed what people hoped for and what they feared. Before, fear often came from visible threats, a failed harvest, a sick animal, a broken roof, a hard winter. Now fear could come from a letter, a contract, a missed payment, a number rising quietly, a debt growing while the person slept. That kind of fear was different. It had no face, no weather, no footsteps. It simply waited. And as economies became more complex, ordinary people had to trust systems they could not fully understand. Banks, markets, employers, prices, interest, taxes, wages, currency. A person could work hard every day and still be affected by decisions made far away. A factory closing, a bank failing, a price changing, a government raising taxes, a merchant losing ships, a war disrupting trade. The village world had been vulnerable to nature. The money world became vulnerable to systems. And systems are difficult to touch. You cannot argue with a storm, but you can see it. You cannot see a financial panic until it has already entered people's lives. That is what made the New World so unsettling. It promised more control while creating new kinds of helplessness. At the same time, money began changing the meaning of desire. In older communities, people wanted better food, better tools, safer homes, stronger animals, warmer clothes, more land, more security. Those desires were direct. They came from need. But as markets expanded, shops filled with objects people had never known before, imported fabrics, new utensils, decorative goods, fine furniture, printed books, sugar, tea, coffee, porcelain, mirrors, clocks. Objects from faraway places began entering ordinary imagination. People started wanting not only what they needed, but what they had seen. This is important. Desire grows when it has images. When people see what others have, they begin to imagine themselves with it. A bright dress, a polished cup, a better coat, a decorated room, a watch, a lamp, a piece of furniture that says, "I am no longer poor." Objects became messages. They told others who you were, or who you wanted to be. Money made those messages easier to buy, and so identity began to move closer to consumption. Not entirely. People were still shaped by family, religion, work, language, place, and memory. But possessions began speaking louder. A person could show success through things. A household could display improvement. A merchant could prove status. A city family could separate itself from the countryside. A worker could dream of rising through visible signs of comfort. This was the beginning of a familiar feeling. The feeling that life should be better, if only you could buy the right things. And once that feeling enters a society, it rarely leaves, because markets do not only answer desire, they create it. They show people what is missing. They teach dissatisfaction gently, not always by force. Sometimes simply by placing something beautiful behind glass, something you do not need, until you see it, something you did not miss, until it becomes a symbol of a better life. This changed the emotional rhythm of daily life. People no longer compared themselves only to neighbours. They compared themselves to images of comfort, to shop windows, to wealthy streets, to printed advertisements, to stories of success, to the lifestyle of people they might never meet. Money became tied to imagination, and imagination has no natural limit. A person can only eat so much bread, wear so many shoes, sleep in one bed at a time, but desire can grow endlessly. That is one reason money became so powerful. It attached itself not only to survival, but to longing. Belonging to be safe, to be admired, to escape shame, to become someone else, to rise above the place where life began. And as the modern age approached, another great shift happened. Work moved from the household and field into larger systems. Workshops became factories. The sun no longer ruled the working day in the same way. Clocks did. A bell could call workers in. A whistle could release them. The day could be divided into hours of production. Time became strict, measured, sold. A worker's body entered the factory, and the clock began counting. This was different from older labour. Farm work had been exhausting, but it followed weather, daylight, animals and seasons. Factory work followed machinery. Machines did not care about tired hands. They did not slow down because a worker was sad. They did not pause for memory. They demanded rhythm. Again, again, again. And money stood at the centre of that rhythm. People worked for wages. Wages paid rent. Rent kept a room. A room allowed sleep. Sleep allowed work again. Life became a circle of earning and paying. For some, this brought opportunity. Factories offered income to people who had lost access to land. Cities offered a chance to survive outside old rural structures. A person could leave a village and search for a different future. But for many, the new world was harsh. Long hours, crowded housing, dirty streets, dangerous work, low wages, uncertain employment. The money economy created movement, but not always dignity. A person could be free from a lord and still trapped by rent, free from the village and still trapped by hunger, free to sell labour, but not free to stop selling it. This is one of history's quiet ironies. Money promised independence, but dependence did not disappear. It changed owner. Instead of depending on land, harvest and local custom, people depended on wages, employers, landlords, and prices. The cage became less visible, but it did not vanish. And yet, people kept moving towards cities, because the city held possibility. Even a difficult possibility can be powerful when the old world offers none. A city could break a person, but it could also transform them. It could give work, education, contacts, ideas, a different name, a different life, and money was the key that seemed to unlock all of it. This is why modern people began to think of money not only as survival, but as freedom. Money could buy distance from old obligations. It could buy privacy. It could buy travel. It could buy education. It could buy better medicine. It could buy time away from hard labour. It could buy silence from those who once judged you. So people chased it. Not because they loved money itself, but because money stood between them and the life they wanted. And this is how money became emotional. It was no longer just a coin, a note, or a number. It became hope, stress, pride, fear, shame, ambition, relief. A person receiving wages might feel safety for a moment. A person losing work might feel the ground disappear beneath them. A person saving money might feel control. A person borrowing might feel trapped. A person with wealth might feel respected. A person without it might feel invisible. Money became tied to identity, and once that happened, poverty became more than material hardship. It became a wound to the self. In older worlds, being poor was still painful, but a poor person could sometimes remain deeply embedded in community, land, and tradition. In the modern money world, poverty could feel like exclusion from life itself, not being able to enter, not being able to choose, not being able to rest, not being able to say yes, not being able to say no. This is a very deep form of power, the power to decide what is possible. At the same time, the wealthy gained new forms of invisibility. A king's palace could be seen, a noble's estate could be seen. But modern wealth could hide behind ownership, shares, investments, banks and companies. Power no longer needed a crown. It could wear a suit, sit behind a desk, sign documents, move numbers, and affect thousands of lives without ever seeing them. That distance changed morality. When harm is close, the heart reacts. When harm is distant, the mind can explain it away. A factory owner might never meet every worker. A banker might never see the family behind a loan. A trader might never see the people affected by prices. A government official might never enter the poor streets shaped by policy. Money allowed decisions to travel farther than compassion. And that is one of its most dangerous abilities. Still, people fought to bring humanity back into the system. Workers organized, communities formed associations, religious groups fed the poor, reformers demanded limits, families supported one another. Neighbors created small circles of care inside large, cold cities. Even in industrial streets, the older economy of help survived. Someone shared food. Someone watched a child. Someone lent a coat. Someone told a newcomer where to find work. Someone gathered people to demand better wages. Money had expanded, but it did not erase the human need for solidarity. In fact, the harsher the money world became, the more people needed each other. The old truth returned in a new form. No one survives alone. Not in a village. Not in a factory town. Not in a modern city. The shape changes, but the need remains. And maybe that is the hidden thread running through the whole story. Money changes the world again and again. It changes trade, power, work, time, desire, status, fear. But beneath all of that, human beings remain vulnerable creatures. They need food, warmth, care, respect, belonging, rest, meaning. Money can help reach these things, but it is not the same as these things. And whenever society forgets that, people suffer. They begin to mistake the symbol for the substance, the number for the life, the wage for the person, the price for the value, the market for the world. But the world is older than money, older than banks, older than coins, older than contracts. Before all of it, there was hunger and harvest, cold and fire, fear and trust, hands working together, people trying to carry one another through uncertainty. And even now, under all the numbers, that older world still exists. It appears whenever someone helps without asking the price, whenever a family shares what little it has, whenever neighbors gather after disaster, whenever love refuses to become a transaction, whenever a person is valued not for what they own, but because they are human. That is the quiet resistance against a world where money becomes everything. Not loud, not always visible, but still alive. And as history moves forward, the question becomes clearer. Can money remain a tool, or will it become the measure of life itself? And now, at the end of this journey, we return to a simple question. What did people have before money became the center of life? They had less comfort, less protection, less medicine, less choice, less control over the future. But they also had a world where value could still be felt directly. A field was not an investment first, it was food. A house was not a market price first, it was shelter. A tool was not a product first, it was survival in the hand. A neighbor was not a contact. They were someone who might help you live through winter. That older world was not perfect. It was often harsh, unequal, and frightening. But it reminds us of something important. Money can measure many things, but not all things. It can measure land, but not belonging. It can measure labor, but not sacrifice. It can measure goods, but not gratitude. It can measure time, but not meaning. And yet, over centuries, money moved closer and closer to the center of human life. It became the language of markets, then the language of power, then the language of survival, and finally, for many people, the language of identity. People began to ask not only, what do I need, but what can I afford? Not only, what can I do, but how much am I worth? That is a heavy change. Because when money becomes the main measure of life, people begin to carry invisible weight. A person can wake in the morning and feel pressure before anything has happened. Bills waiting, rent waiting, debt waiting, work waiting, prices changing, a future that must be paid for before it can be lived. This is very different from the older fear of weather, harvest or hunger, but it comes from the same place. The fear of not having enough food, enough shelter, enough safety, enough time, enough dignity. Money became powerful because it attached itself to these needs. It stood between people and the things that make life possible. And once it stood there, people had to follow it. Across fields, across oceans, into mines, into factories, into offices, into lives where nearly every dream required a price. But the strange thing is this: even when money became everywhere, the deepest human needs did not change. People still wanted warmth. They still wanted love. They still wanted rest. They still wanted to be remembered kindly. They still wanted someone to notice when they were gone. They still wanted a place where they did not have to prove their worth every day. No coin ever replaced that. No bank ever replaced that. No market ever replaced that. Because human life is older than the systems built around it. Before money, people gathered around fires. After money, they still did. Before markets, people cared for children. After markets, they still did. Before banks, people grieved, celebrated, feared, hoped, prayed and loved. And after banks, they still did. Money changed the world around life, but it did not become life itself. Even now, when we look back at those older communities, what stays with us is not the amount they owned. It is the closeness of things. The way bread came from visible labour, the way warmth came from gathered wood, the way reputation came from action, the way survival depended on people whose names you knew. There is something powerful in that, because it reminds us that value once had a face, a hand, a season, a story. It was not always hidden behind numbers. It was carried in memory. In a repaired roof, in a shared meal, in a field worked by generations, in a skill passed from parent to child, in the quiet trust between people who had no choice but to depend on one another. And perhaps this is why the old world still pulls at the imagination. Not because we want its suffering back, not because we want its hunger, disease, or injustice, but because somewhere inside it there was a truth the modern world often buries. Life is not made only by earning, it is made by caring, by building, by giving, by receiving, by remembering, by belonging. The old world knew this because it had to. When danger was near, no one could pretend to be completely independent. A broken tool mattered, a missing neighbour mattered, a sick animal mattered, a failed harvest mattered, a cold night mattered. Every part of life touched every other part. Nothing was truly separate, and maybe that is what money slowly changed. It separated things: work from home, price from value, labour from product, people from the hands that made what they used, the rich from the poor, the buyer from the maker, the number from the human being behind it. This separation made the world faster, larger, more connected, more efficient, but also lonelier. Because when everything becomes a transaction, people can begin to forget how to receive without suspicion and how to give without calculation. They can forget that not every debt is written, not every gift must return profit, not every hour must produce money, not every life should be measured by usefulness. There are things that matter simply because they are human. A quiet conversation, a safe home, a child laughing, a tired person being allowed to rest, an elder being listened to, a stranger being treated with kindness, a family sharing food, a friend staying. These things are not outside history. They are the foundation beneath it. Kings rise and fall. Empires expand and disappear. Markets change. Currencies collapse. But these smaller human moments continue. They are the hidden economy of civilization. The economy of care. The one that existed before coins. The one that survived after coins. The one that still appears whenever people remember that life is not only about what can be bought. This does not mean money has no place. Money can help. It can organize. It can protect. It can make exchange possible between strangers. It can allow people to move, build, heal, learn, and create. The problem was never that money existed. The problem begins when money becomes the highest voice in the room, when it decides who matters, who rests, who eats, who learns, who is safe, who is heard, who is invisible. That is when a tool becomes a master. And history shows us that humans have always struggled with this. Ancient people worried about greed. Medieval people warned about the soul. Religious teachers spoke against worshipping wealth. Communities judged those who took too much and gave too little. Even long ago, people understood that money was dangerous when it forgot its place. Because money is powerful, but empty. It has no memory of kindness, no sense of fairness unless people create it, no mercy unless people demand it, no loyalty unless law, culture, and conscience shape it. Money moves where it is allowed to move. It becomes what society permits it to become, and that means the story is not finished. It never has been. Every generation decides again what money should serve: life or power, community or greed, dignity or endless comparison, human needs or numbers without end. Before money became everything, people lived with another kind of knowledge. They knew that survival came from the world itself, from land, water, animals, hands, fire, skill. They knew that a person with no one to help them was in danger. They knew that food had to be grown, not just bought. That warmth had to be made, not just paid for. That trust had to be earned, not purchased. And maybe that is the lesson worth carrying forward. Not that the past was better, but that the past remembered certain truths more clearly. The truth that life begins before price, that value begins before currency, that human worth begins before wealth. Long before coins passed between hands, people were already creating value. A mother feeding a child, a farmer saving seed, a healer preparing herbs, a builder shaping wood, a neighbor lending strength, a storyteller keeping memory alive. None of these needed money to matter. They mattered because life depended on them. And in the end, perhaps that is the quietest answer to the whole story. Before money became everything, life was still difficult. But value was not yet trapped inside one symbol. It lived everywhere. In the soil, in the home, in the body, in the village, in the promise, in the firelight, in the simple act of helping another person continue. So as this journey closes, imagine one last scene. Not a palace, not a bank, not a market, just a small home at the edge of an old village. The day is ending, smoke rises from the roof, a family gathers near the fire. Outside, the fields darken, tools are placed against the wall, Bread is shared slowly. Someone tells a story. Someone repairs a piece of cloth. Someone listens to the wind. There is no wealth in the modern sense, no luxury, no endless choice. But there is warmth. There is food. There is memory. There are people together, facing the night. And for a moment, nothing has a price. It simply has meaning. That is the world before money became everything. Not perfect, not easy, not gentle, but deeply alive. And somewhere beneath the noise of the modern world, that older truth still waits, quietly, patiently, reminding us that money can buy many things, but it should never be allowed to define everything.